Alright, in this video, Berocca Obama gets a fret dress. Fret dressing and fretwork in general is a huge topic, and I'm barely going to scratch the surface with this bass. But something that really helped me out when I was sort of getting into it back in the 90s was Dan Earlywine's book called Fretwork Step by Step. Thought that was a really nice resource and a good read. Plenty of images and plenty of different techniques and so on. I also worked for a guitar manufacturing company for several years, and although I didn't work in the setup room full time, I certainly did plenty of shifts there. And when you work in a place like that, you're just fret dressing all day, and it's great for your chops. But of course, at Maton, these were acoustic guitars, brand new acoustic guitars for that matter. And when you start working on seasoned instruments or even vintage instruments, you know, your approach and the type of fretwork you do is very different from a brand new guitar for fairly obvious reasons. And bass guitars are different again. In general, luckily with bass guitars, you rarely get the really heavy fret wear with divots in the fretwork. That does happen, but it seems a bit rarer on bass guitars. The flip side of that is that the necks tend to be bowed. If you have a bass guitar that's 8 or 10 years old or more, it's pretty rare that the neck hasn't found some kind of set in an up bow. And by that I mean, if you take the strings off and slacken the rod off, and then so you're taking all the forces off the timber, and then you let the neck settle, the neck will virtually always have some kind of up bow or even a slight twist to it. It's just something you have to deal with bass guitars. This guy is actually in pretty good shape. The neck, I've already had a look, it's got a little bit of an up bow, but it's not too bad. Also, as I mentioned in the intro video, the fretwork is in really great shape, and the fret ends have been really nicely done, and the fretwork has been installed quite well as well in the factory. The first step is to get the board nice and flat. For that, a notched straight edge is really handy because you can sight the fretboard without the frets themselves interfering. So right now it's actually back bowed because I haven't released the truss rod, I've just taken the strings off. So that's the first thing I have to do, is adjust the truss rod and try and get the neck nice and flat. So that's now pretty straight. It's just a tiny bit off the fretboard down in the first fret, and there's a little bit of a dip on the fretboard right between the sort of 12th and 15th frets. If you put a light there, you might be able to just see a bit of light underneath. That's actually pretty common for bass guitars. It's right where the neck profile goes from square into round, and it's pretty common for a neck to have a little bit of a dip there, or essentially a slightly rising neck heel. I'll also pick this bass up into the playing position and have a look at it from there. The weight of the headstock and the machine heads and everything will actually affect the way the neck reacts to gravity, I guess. So it's a good idea to check it in the playing position as well. And actually I'm going to just slacken that rod off just a hair more. So yeah, look, that's about as straight as I can get this fretboard, and it's still extremely flat, so I don't even think I need files on the frets. I think I'm just going to kiss the tops with some sandpaper. So this neck has what's known as a compound radius, and that means, well, this one starts around about 15 and finishes about 18. If you're working on a vintage instrument, a vintage Fender or something, it's obviously important to respect the original radius of the board. If you're doing a lot of fret dressing, or you're removing a fair bit of material off the frets, a radiused sanding block is quite handy, but not completely necessary, but it is pretty handy to have. With these, again, I'm just going to kiss the tops and just work side to side. They really don't need a lot of love. So the next step is to use fret rockers. You can buy these, but I made these years and years ago out of just a ruler that I cut up. I'm sure I've shown you these in another video, but I tend to lay them on the string lines and feel for any high spots by rocking the fret. There's one. So the E string on this second fret. So literally just touch that 2 or 3 times, and that's fine. And I'll move on for every string on every fret. Boy, these are great. Okay, so this 11th fret has some high spots for sure. You can really feel them. I'm not sure if you can hear them. So the D one is especially high. A is not too bad, E is fine, and then it's a little bit high on the B string. And in fact, it's been a few weeks since I've played this with strings on at this bass, but I definitely remember a few buzzes up around here. So I'm going to focus my filing on this part of the fret. I'm also going to just touch it at the edge of the fret where the B string is as well. Really just 2 or 3 strokes. Still high on the A string, just a bit high on the B. So I think the 11th fret will need crowning after this amount of material has been removed from the top. So that's fine. I'll move on, finish the fretboard, and we'll come back to this one. If you're new to this and you're practicing on your junk fretboards and stuff, it's not a bad idea to put masking tape on the fretboard. It just saves you a bit of work really if you slip up with the files, or if you're just trying new files or new techniques. It's a good idea. I've now got probably 6 or 8 spots on these frets that have a little bit of sort of diagonal scratching from my little file. So I'm just going to again work those scratches crossways with my 320 grit paper, just locally in those spots. It really takes very little effort. As long as you have a nice even shiny mark across the top of the fret, it'll be fine. So I'm just marking just 3 or 4 frets where I've had to remove a little bit of material across the top. There's our 11th fret. That will certainly need crowning. The 12th got a little bit of action as well. And I thought there was one more up a bit further, but it doesn't. Yes, it's the second last fret. Actually, the top 2 frets need crowning. So I'll do those 2 as well. Traditionally, you crown frets with a triangular or even a square file, but you need to grind the edges off. That way you can localize your filing just to that part of the file. To be honest, I think most guys these days will use a dedicated fret crowning file. This, as you can probably see, I've had for many years. It's a StewMac file. It still seems to be pretty sharp, even though it's had a lot of use. The goal is to get a nice thin black line evenly across the top of the fret, and these are fine. For me, the next step is to wrap some 400 grit paper around the fret file, and that's kind of like the first step in polishing, and it's also a way of removing any file marks from the sides of that crown. Before I move on to the steel wool for the fretwork, there's a few string marks on the fretboard I want to remove. just around about here, and there's a couple more here. And the easiest way to remove those is with a Stanley blade. So next I'll use some 4/0 steel wool with the fret guard. If you're going to use steel wool around guitars, you have to be very careful because it sheds. And if you have pickups, especially ones with open magnets, like Fender and Stingray type pickups, the steel wool will be attracted to the magnets, and it can actually get inside the pickups and kind of cause problems. So if you haven't removed the neck, you want to tape up the pickups. So the final step for the fretboard is to give it a coat of wax or oil. You can just use the fretboard oil that you buy, the Jim Dunlop type stuff, or there's lots of different brands. And what you're doing with that is just basically feeding the pores of the timber. I prefer to use something like this. This actually is a mixture of oil and wax, and it will actually separate slightly in the tin. So if you do have a really dry board, you can just use the citrus oil that's in there. But the Canava wax itself is a very hard wearing wax. This is also brown, which is quite nice. If you do have a rosewood board that has a lot of pits in it, you don't get the little white streaks that a wax would normally give. If the board is grubby, you need to clean it down with white spirit first, and I like to work the wax side to side to really mooch it into the grain. I've got to get the build up from around the frets, and that's easily done just with my thumbnail with the rag around it. So now I've got all the excess from around the frets. It's such a hot day that this is already starting to tack. So I'm actually just going to wipe the excess off just gently, so I don't want to remove it all. I'm just going to wipe the excess off. Already that's a little bit shiny, but I'm going to leave that for an hour or so, and then I'm going to buff it off. And while that's getting hard, that wax, I'm going to service the machine heads. Well, I'm sure I've shown this in one of my other videos, but generally I like to lubricate all the parts that need lubrication and reinstall these screws with some Loctite because they were more or less finger tight. That's just a little smear of general purpose grease around the inside of the front bushing. That seems to be the place with the most friction for bass machines. And that's just a single drop of medium Loctite. With these machine heads, I can do the same with this screw as well. In fact, oh yeah, that was really loose too. So again, a drop of Loctite on this guy, and it'll also allow me to adjust the tension on these machine heads as well. So with the machine heads all serviced and ready to go, it's just a matter of buffing up this wax. You can see it just sort of gets a bit hazy once it dries. And there you go. It just gives the fretboard a little bit of a luster and also a bit of a protective surface. Well, I think that'll do us for this video. If you've just discovered my channel, hit subscribe. I'm doing a whole series with this orange Berocca coloured bass, and not just setup work. I'm actually going to do a whole stack of mods as well. I'm going to respray the body, I'm going to rewind the pickup, and I'm also going to design a whole new preamp for the bass from scratch. And of course I'm going to show you guys how to do all that stuff as well along the way. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.